Hi, Julie Usher, Recipes for a Sweet Life. I've been having a lot of fun lately working with the SugarVeil product. SugarVeil is basically a material used to make edible cake lace, traditionally to make edible cake lace. It's comprised of sugar, egg whites, xanthan gum, and a few other things, and it makes this incredibly versatile material that stretches, yet is extremely delicate and can be molded and shaped into all sorts of things. I use it extensively in my collaboration video, which you should go check out, where I make these enameled cookie boxes. Today, though, I'm going to give you a double feature, if you will, kind of a primer on how to use SugarVeil. We're going to start by talking about how to make a single color lace. Here's a beautiful lace made with our laces mat, and you can see how flexible it is. Wouldn't it make great fabric or jewelry or a dress? And I'm also going to show you how to make a dual tone lace using their grasses mat. And we're going to use this in a much less conventional way than just making a strip of lace. I'm actually going to cut it and shape it into these really fun and beautiful flowers and leaves with lots of color and variegation. So before we get started, just a couple words on SugarVeil. SugarVeil is the original edible lace product. It came about 12 years ago. There have been a number of knockoffs since then. All of the products behave somewhat differently, so all the instructions for making lace that you're about to see are very particular to this product. So just bear that in mind as we go through the rest of the video. So let's talk about the primary tools you'll need for making both single colored lace and dual lace. Of course, we need SugarVeil mats. We're working with their lace mat for the single color lace. We'll be working with our grasses mat for a dual color lace, which will go into some of the flowers and leaves we're making later. Of course, you need cornstarch and a brush to lightly dust the mats to keep the SugarVeil mixture from sticking as it sets. You'll need SugarVeil itself. I've got 2/3 of a cup of it here to 1/3 a cup of water. These are the ratios for their quick oven setting method. Rather than letting the lace dry overnight, we're going to quick set it in the oven so that we can pull it more immediately, which is ultra convenient. You'll also need a couple of other SugarVeil tools. They've got this nifty spreader, which is designed for spreading the mixed SugarVeil mixture into the mats and getting a nice thin layer. And their confectioner's fin tool, which is used for getting a nice clean edge. I use this sometimes. More often I use it to scrape off and clean off the spreader. We'll also need a damp cloth. This might look like an unassuming, unimportant tool, but it's a really critical one for wiping down the lace once it comes out of the oven to ensure that there's no film covering any of the holes that you want to open. And then lastly, I've got food coloring for coloring the SugarVeil material. SugarVeil recommends a dry powdered color if you want really intense colors in the lace, but I found that my liquid gel Chef Master coloring, the same stuff I use for royal icing, works rather well in the medium to dark range of colors. So we'll be working with that today as we work with the grasses mat. Okay, we're back to mix the SugarVeil mixture. So I've got 2/3 a cup of SugarVeil in there and 1/3 a cup of just room temperature tap water. And I'm going to give them a quick whisk, about 30 seconds worth of whisking just to get the ingredients combined. And I do follow the SugarVeil mixing instructions. They've got detailed instructions on their website rather explicitly because I find they're very, very good and very exact. So once we've got that roughly together, you'll still see a few lumps in it. That's typical. That will go away as we beat it. Now it's looking kind of a creamy, kind of yellow-white as well, and you'll notice a big color change as we mix it. Now for the quick setting method, they recommend whipping for exactly 4 minutes. So I'm setting my timer. And to use the paddle attachment so you don't pump in too much air. We want to do this also on medium speed. If you whip it on high speed with a whip attachment, you'll incorporate much more air and get a much more aerated product, one that's more prone to breaking with more bubbles in it, and we don't want that. So I'm going to run this between 6 and 8 on my KitchenAid, but 7 for 4 minutes. I might give it a scrape down in between. And just watch the color change. It'll go from kind of this murky yellow to very white. Four minutes, exactly. And you'll notice how very bright white it is, and it's gone from that kind of soupy, curdled kind of texture to something very viscous. yet still pourable. SugarVeil recommends, and I also recommend, that you use this material as soon as it reaches this state. If it sits for an hour or more, you're definitely going to want to re-whip it with the same paddle attachment for a minute or two to restore it to this white state. What will happen is it will get creamy yellow and kind of more bubbly, just much more difficult to spread into the mat without introducing bubbles. I've also stored this overnight, and it thickens considerably overnight, so I do prefer to use it almost immediately. We need to prepare our mat. So we are preparing it by dusting it with cornstarch. This will just keep the lace from, or help keep the lace from sticking. Sometimes the lace can still stick. SugarVeil is very humidity sensitive, and this drying process is also very humidity sensitive. So if you're drying on a dry day, you may have to dry the lace in the oven less time before you pull it from the mat. Whereas if you're drying on a humid day, it will stay tacky longer and you may need to dry it even longer. Now, I've got a lot of cornstarch in there. I like to get it into all the crevices initially, but then I want to brush out or shake out the excess because you don't want an accumulation appearing in the lace in any one spot. Okay, to spread, a very little bit goes quite a long way. A few tablespoons will probably fill this whole mat. It's very, very delicate lace. But I usually nonetheless start with an ample tablespoon about at the top, and also one kind of midway, just to make sure I make the whole length of the lace with material. And we may need to add some in areas as we go and subtract some, most certainly. I'm just going to hold down this lace. I find that since I cut the mat in half, it tends to shift a little bit more than it might otherwise. So I want to give it a quick spread, make sure I get good coverage all the way down. Got a lot in certain areas, as you can see here, and very little in these areas. So the key thing with SugarVeil is not just to spread in one direction, but rather spread in multiple directions to make sure you get the material into all of the openings evenly. I'm looking very closely to see if there are any small pores anywhere as well. And if they are, I'm just, spreading over those areas to make sure they get filled. If they don't, those will be gaps in the lace that could potentially break when we pull it from the mold. So I'd like to do one final pass with the blade completely clean, not just cleaning it with the fin tool. I just feel like this gives a better end result. And I'm holding the blade also, I should note, at a low angle. And this just makes sure that the material is really packed into those grooves as opposed to holding it at a 90-degree angle where you might actually take material out of the grooves. I think that looks pretty good. At this point, you could come in with a fin tool and just clean up your edge a little bit. It's got a little groove here that cleans up the edge, but it's not so necessary here. We're going to, with a single color lace, it'll be more necessary with the dual color lace. I am ready now to put this in the oven to quick set. And as I said, the setting time really does vary with the mat itself, the depth of the mat, the amount of material in it, and also the ambient humidity. I'm going to put it in for about 8.5 minutes. Okay, I'm not sure if I mentioned what temperature this was drying at, but it was about, that's the timer, 8.5 minutes at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. And what I'm looking for is for it to be dry to the touch, which it is around the edges. And it's also dry to the touch. It's a little tacky in the center, so I need to be careful about handling it there. I might just start wiping around the edges to clean up the film here and let it sit a little bit before I hit the center, because I might smudge it if it's too moist in the center. Now I've got a damp cloth here. That unassuming towel I talked about is really important because it cleans up all this film on the edge so that that doesn't show up when you pull the lace. You don't want to see that. So I'm not really digging into it. I'm kind of just gently rubbing with the flat side of my cloth. And it's particularly important to do this around the outer edges because, as I mentioned earlier, they tend to dry faster. They are closer to the edges of the oven, which are often hotter. And so they tend to dry faster, and there's a possibility of them becoming more brittle. So this damp cloth also introduces a little more moisture to keep them from, the lace from completely drying out. Because you can over-bake this, over-dry it, and it will just crack. So we're trying to avoid that. We're trying to get it at just the right point. You'll know if it's too tacky to wipe down because you'll start pulling the lace out of the holes. And once you start doing that, you just want to stop and let it dry here a little bit longer before you wipe further. I think a good amount of the film is gone. If you've missed places, it's not the end of the world because you can actually pop it out with your trussing needle. So now, is it ready to remove from the mat? The key indicator is whether, if you turn down a corner, if it comes up easily without breaking and without stretching. It should be rather rigid. Whoops, I got a little break there. But it seems to be almost ready. So what I'm going to do is, because this corner is coming up nicely, is invert it and begin the peeling process. I've inverted it onto parchment paper. Invert it onto almost any other thing. It can get sticky and stick to it. So do invert it onto parchment paper. I roughed up the edge here because I tried to pull it and it was still a little damp. So I put it back in the oven for a minute or two to dry it just a little bit further. And I'm using my spreader tool now once again for a different way to help hold down the lace as I gently pull back the mat. So I just switched sides just so I could get a better view of the lace coming out and how it's pulling, because I didn't have a good visibility. But the lace is coming out of the mat rather nicely. I like to pull gradually because it tends to be moister in the center, and we don't want to tear the lace as we get to a particularly moist part. So it's beginning to stretch here and misshape. So I'm just going to let this sit a little bit upside down before I pull off through the middle, because I don't want to distort the lace. I'm just going to finish the peeling process. It was a little damp in the middle and stretching, but with a little bit of additional drying time, it's easy enough to peel it away quite beautifully. And then we're back to the end that we started with. Okay, and so as I pointed out, I didn't wipe down altogether as thoroughly as I could in some areas. You'll see a little bit of film in some of these holes here, but that's not a big deal. I'm going to be putting this on my enamel jewelry boxes in a future video, and before I put it on, I'm actually going to take my trusting needle and pop some of that out, and it'll look just like perfect. Now, I'm not going to use this immediately on the boxes, so what I want to do is make sure it gets stored on parchment paper in a large baggie. The 3-gallon baggie sizes are perfect for this size lace, so that it doesn't dry out or get too floppy. If it's really humid, it'll get really moist. If it's really dry, it can become brittle and crack and be no longer flexible. You'll see right now it's quite flexible. I can bend it into ribbons or bows or wrap it around a box. Okay, onto the two-tone lace. So just to color the SugarVeil for dual color lace, I've already got a light green, which you see in here, in the mat, drying in the oven. So I'm mixing now a darker green color. Again, just using my liquid gel food coloring. I find that it behaves pretty well even in relatively dark shades in this material. So I just want to get this like a shade or two darker than the light green that I started with, so that it contrasts what's in the mat already. Okay, so the process with the two-tone lace is the same as with the single lace. I'm just working with a grasses mat, and I've laid a light green in here. This is now dried actually about 8.5 minutes. Again, you want to wipe down when it comes out of the oven to remove any film that's covering the blue areas, because that film will show up against the dark that we're going to apply in the background later if you don't wipe it off. You want to apply the second coating of SugarVeil when this is not tacky, because if you spread over tacky material, you'll take it out of the grooves. So you want to make sure this is still pliable, but not tacky. Usually a finger test will give you a good indication of whether you can spread over it without disrupting it. I think it's ready. We're just going to add the dark green over the top, and again, a little bit typically goes a long way, but I'll lay it down in 2 areas to make sure I get pretty good coverage across the whole mat. And I may need to add or subtract as we go along. It's a little bit harder to get the dark green or the color that's going on the back down uniformly because there are no grooves for it to sink into. So you'll just have to use your judgment. Sometimes you'll see a little unevenness in color, areas where it's thin and thick. And typically that hasn't been a problem for me. You'll end up seeing more color when you pull it off the mat than you might think you would, just on the basis of looking at the back of the mat. So here, for instance, it looks thin, here it looks heavy, but that thin area actually does have some green film on it that will show when you peel it off the mat. Maybe not quite enough, but it definitely has some. And as before, I want to kind of wipe in all different directions with a low angle of the blade, ideally holding it with 2 hands. I feel like I've got a lot of extra on the blade here, which I do. So this is where the fin tool comes in handy. I can clean that off. And now on my final swipes, I just want to get this a little more uniform looking, so I don't have any big chunks of it anywhere. I'm pressing rather lightly but uniformly. And I think that's going to be good. Okay, it's ready to go in the oven. It's still a little lean there, but I think that's the best I can do. And I think when we pull it, it'll be just fine. Okay, it's out of the oven. I'm going to get an edge here and then try to invert this. It's, again, pretty dry to the touch in the middle, so I think it's ready to be pulled. It's also peeling away pretty easily from the edges. Voila, there it is, finished lace. Okay, so here it is all trimmed up. I got rid of the rough edges. Some were a little dry, but also they're ragged and we're not going to be cutting from those pieces, so they'll just get in the way later. But it's a nice piece of lace, and right now I could use it immediately or put it in a plastic baggie for storage. Okay, so we're going to start with the leaves. I've got a two-tone lace that I did earlier using the grasses mat, and these leaves are super simple. I'm just going to cut from a good area of the lace. I just cut out really with scissors, regular old scissors. I cut straight. So just cutting little leaf type shapes like so. They don't have to be perfect. And you might find you have better control with smaller scissors. That's fine too. And then what I do to shape them is I just simply pinch the bottom. When I'm working with SugarVeil, I always have a little bit of cornstarch and a little bit of water near me. So if they're not sticky enough and they don't stick together at the end, I can dab them with a little bit of water. Whereas if they're too sticky and they're sticking to my hands, I can just dab my hands in a little bit of cornstarch and get them to release from my fingers. So that's one leaf. I like to make little bundles of leaves. I think they often look better. We'll be putting these on cupcakes later, and I think that looks pretty darn cool when we've got little leaf bundles together. You also have the option of using decorative shears from the craft store to make more of a convoluted edge to the leaf. And here you want to cut in one direction, then flip and cut back in the other direction so that the variegation is all facing the same direction. And then just to form the leaf, this is the tip of the leaf, I just simply pinch it together like so. And then if I want to put it together with another leaf, this is pretty sticky, so I'm not needing to add any more water. I just pinch them together. So I'm going to do a really tiny leaf to add to that trio, just using slightly smaller scissors here. They're a little more manageable. The other thing to point out is I'm cutting along the grain, if you will, of this grasses mat so that the stripes are going along the length of the leaf. I just think it elongates the leaf. I think it looks more lifelike, if anything. And as you can see, just a really tiny leaf. And to add that to this bunch here, I'll just press it in. I don't think I need any additional water today to hold them together because it is rather humid. And then to set them aside to dry, I do like to do this. This one's been drying, as you'll notice, in my little hemisphere mold containers. That's one way to dry them. If you don't have a hemisphere mold container, because they are rather expensive, I use them for many different things. You can also drape them over the edges of items. So for instance, I have a lot of styrofoam forms around for whatever reason. So just setting them to rest and drape over the edge of something and putting a bend in them while they're still moist will give them a lot of dimension. Then set these aside in a dry environment for them to fully set up. If you've got a really humid day, definitely air condition your space to allow them to dry. If you don't have an air conditioner, then I suggest doing these on a dry day so that they can dry in your normal ambient conditions. Once completely dry, you want to contain them in an airtight container so that they don't change shape. And now I'm going to use the same grasses mat to form these fun little flowers. In fact, I'm doing exactly this color combination, the blue and purple. Again, I start with the grasses mat and do a two-tone coloration, but instead of using a light green and a dark green as I used with the leaves, I first laid the blue in and then I spread the purple behind it to create this particular effect. And you can do it many different ways. This, for instance, has yellow laid in the grooves and then purple spread behind it. This has pink in the grooves with purple spread behind it. Generally speaking, it's easier and you'll get a cleaner looking result if you spread the darker color behind a lighter color. And here I'm using just a normal craft paper punch with a little fluted edge. You could also use a straight edged round. Okay, so I like to feed the paper in upside down because the top tends to be drier than the bottom. And also with the punch upside down so I can make sure that it's completely within the space before I punch. And then I just simply punch and out comes a piece. And if the SugarVeil isn't too sticky, I can easily slide it over without taking it out of the punch and resituate it and punch again. And you want to punch out about 9 or 10 of these for each flower. That one's a little wrinkled at the bottom, but that's okay because I'm going to be pinching the flower at the bottom, so it's not the end of the world. As you go across the mat, if you have ragged edges that didn't pull well off the mat, you'll probably want to trim those first so you come in with a clean edge on the punch. If you're in the middle of forming flowers and you want to use the extra, again, remember to contain that in a plastic bag so that it doesn't dry out. So for the inner core, you can fold it any which way. You can put the color out or the pure purple side forward. And in most cases, I don't think it matters, but the next few petals, because this isn't so visible, it's just the very central core. The next few petals, I'm going to put them in a decisive order. So I'm just basically rolling this while it's still flexible to create a central core. And again, pinching it at the bottom. This is pretty moist, so I don't need to add any of the additional water to get it to stick together. If it weren't so moist, I'd dab a little bit of water on the end, and then I'd probably immediately douse my fingers in cornstarch so that I could handle it without it sticking to my hand. So here I just wrap it around. This is much the way you'd make, say, a rose or something out of modeling chocolate or rolled fondant. Just kind of overlapping the petals and pinching at the bottom. And the first couple I don't give much flair to. I like them kind of standing straight up. That's just my preference. But if you wanted to, you can try to bend them back a little bit because the material is still very pliable at this point. And I'm going to wrap one more in this direction with a purple facing towards the inside. And now I'm going to swap directions and start putting the petals with the striped edge facing the inside. I just think that gives a little more interest and a sense of depth and darkness to the interior of the flower. So I'm just adding, overlapping the petals as we go, and eventually as I come to the outside, I've now got 4 or 5 down, I'll start turning them down like so. And this one, just to give you a point of reference, is now maybe 1.5 inches to 2 inches across. These were cut with a 1 1/4 inch. These were about a 1 1/4 inch petal. So the larger the petal you cut, the bigger the punch you use, the bigger the flower you'll end up with. So you can adjust size by simply cutting smaller rounds. I do like to form them in my silicone mold, just let them dry in my silicone mold so that, rather than setting them on their side, because right now they're still quite soft, and if I set them on the side, they'll just smush and lose all that dimension. So if I set them in this mold, or if you have small little paper cups, that works well too. And put them face down like so. They'll dry much more uniformly, and that's how all of these were dried. So that completes the little flower tutorial. So what I would do at this point, again, these are very prone to changes in humidity. They can get very soft if they get exposed to too much moisture. So I would take this whole piece so they retain their shape and slip it into another airtight container and leave that in a cool, dry place until I wanted to use them. And they have an infinite storage life if you store them properly. If you're interested in other applications of SugarVeil, I recommend you go over to my collaboration video where I show how to make what looks like an enameled cookie box. I actually wrap that single white lace piece around a round cookie to make an elaborate wedding gift, if you will. So please check that out. Till next video, live sweetly.